Good evening, peasants of Camelmore, and welcome to the final episode of The Princess and the Goblin. It has been such a treat to read George McDonald's Princess and the Goblin to you, and I sincerely hope that I get to continue reading more stories to you in the future. But what that means is none of you are allowed to leave Camelmore. Well, you can do whatever you want, but I highly encourage you not to leave Camelmore because we have lots of cool things here. We have stories, and Rolfe's here. Come on, Rolfe, say something.
Yeah, I'm here! Go, please don't leave! We're gonna miss you!
Yes, we're all gonna miss you up here in the castle. I know you've only heard Rolfe and I speaking, but from all of us at the castle, which includes our court wizard Randolph, our diplomatic leader Ruth, our town accountant and administrator Alexandria, and our beautiful head knight Lamsley, we all will miss you so very much.
Yeah, but it's mostly me that's gonna miss you!
Don't worry, Rolfe. I don't think any of them will be leaving. Isn't that right, peasants? Yes, I will take your silence as yes. All right, now let's go ahead and dive into the final chapters. Last time, we left off on the goblins finally making their way into the wine cellar of the king's house, or the castle. Luckily, Curdy was able to get out and help all of the knights and men-at-arms fight the goblins by stamping on their feetsies. But do remember, Curdy overheard that if this plan doesn't work, they have a second plan. Do you remember what that is, Rolfe?
Drowning!
Indeed. All right, let's get into it. Chapter 29, titled Mason Work. He, referring to Curdy, had all at once remembered the resolution of the goblins to carry out their second plan upon the failure of the first. Just like you and I were talking about, Rolfe. No doubt they were already busy, and the mine was therefore in the greatest danger of being flooded and rendered useless, not to speak of the lives of the miners. When he reached the mouth of the mine, after rousing all the miners within reach, he found his father and a good many more just entering. They all hurried to the gang by which he had found a way into the goblin country. Remember, a gang is one of the tunnels dug underneath the ground. There, the foresight of Peter had already collected a great many blocks of stone with cement ready for building up the weak place, well enough known to the goblins. Although there was not room for more than two to be actually building at once, they managed, by setting all the rest to work in preparing the cement and passing the stones, to finish in the course of the day a huge buttress filling the whole gang and supported everywhere by the live rock. A buttress, though a silly word I do think, actually means a projecting support of stone or a brick built against a wall. So it's just there to support the wall and the ceiling. Before the hour when they usually dropped work, they were satisfied that the mine was secure. They had heard goblin hammers and pickaxes busy all the time, and at length fancied they heard sounds of water they had never heard before. But that was otherwise accounted for when they left the mine, for they stepped out into a tremendous storm which was raging all over the mountain. The thunder was bellowing, and the lightning lancing out of a huge black cloud which lay above it, and hung down its edges of thick mist over its sides. The lightning was breaking out of the mountain too, and flashing up into the cloud. From the state of the brooks, now swollen into raging torrents, it was evident that the storm had been storming all day. The wind was blowing as if it would blow him off the mountain. But, anxious about his mother and the princess, Curdy darted up through the thick of the tempest. Even if they had not set out before the storm came on, he did not judge them safe. For, in such a storm, even their poor little house was in danger. Indeed, he soon found that, but for a huge rock against which it was built, and which protected it both from the blasts and the waters, it must have been swept if it was not blown away. For the two torrents, into which this rock parted the rush of water behind it, united again in front of the cottage. Two roaring and dangerous streams, which his mother and the princess could not possibly have passed. It was with great difficulty that he forced his way through one of them, and up to the door. The moment his hand fell on the latch, through all the uproar of winds and waters came the joyous cry of the princess.
There's Curdy! Curdy! Curdy!
She was sitting wrapped in blankets on the bed, his mother trying for the 100th time to light the fire, which had been drowned by the rain that came down the chimney. The clay floor was one mass of mud, and the whole place looked wretched. But the faces of the mother and the princess shone as if their troubles only made them merrier. Curdy laughed at sight of them.
I never had such fun,
said the princess, her eyes twinkling and her pretty teeth shining.
How nice it must be to live in a cottage on the mountain.
It all depends on what kind your inside house is,
said the mother.
I know what you mean,
said Irene.
That's the kind of thing my grandmother says.
By the time Peter returned, the storm was nearly over, but the streams were so fierce and so swollen that it was not only out of the question for the princess to go down the mountain, but most dangerous for Peter even, or Curdy, to make the attempt in the gathering darkness.
They will be dreadfully frightened about you,
said Peter to the princess.
But we cannot help it. We must wait till the morning.
With Curdy's help, the fire was lighted at last, and the mother set about making their supper, and after supper they all told the princess stories till she grew sleepy. Then Curdy's mother laid her in Curdy's bed, which was in a tiny little garret room. As soon as she was in bed, through a little window low down in the roof, she caught sight of her grandmother's lamp, shining far away beneath. And she gazed at the beautiful silvery globe until she fell fast asleep. And there was chapter 29.
So did the goblins actually flood everything, or was it just a storm? What was it?
Well, it seemed it could have been either or both. Remember, the human miners, when they got out, thought that all the water they heard inside was actually just the storm outside.
Right, but the goblins were trying to flood everything, so I think it was both.
Ah, good thought, Rolfe. Let's move on to the next chapter.
Wait. What was that word you said earlier? Buttress?
Yes, buttress. What about it?
I don't know, I just like to say it. Buttress!
All right, that's enough, Rolfe. We get it. It doesn't mean what you think it means. It's just a supporting structure of stone, all right?
All right.
Now, let's move on to chapter 30, titled The King and the Kiss. Ooh, who shall be kissing who? Well, let's find out. The next morning, the sun rose so bright that Irene said the rain had washed his face and let the light out clean. The torrents were still roaring down the side of the mountain, but they were so much smaller as not to be dangerous in the daylight. After an early breakfast, Peter went to his work, and Curdy and his mother set out to take the princess home. They had difficulty in getting her dry across the streams, and Curdy had again and again to carry her. But at last, they got safe on the broader part of the road, and walked gently down toward the king's house. And what should they see as they turned the last corner but the last of the king's troop, riding through the gate?
Oh, Curdy,
cried Irene, clapping her hands right joyfully.
My king papa is come.
The moment Curdy heard that, he caught her up in his arms and set off at full speed, crying,
Come on, mother dear! The king may break his heart before he knows that she is safe.
Irene clung round his neck, and he ran with her like a deer. When he entered the gate into the court, there sat the king on his horse, with all the people of the house about him, weeping and hanging their heads. The king was not weeping, but his face was white as a dead man's, and he looked as if the life had gone out of him. The men-at-arms he had brought with him sat with horror-stricken faces, but eyes flashing with rage, waiting only for the word of the king to do something. They did not know what, and nobody knew what. The day before, the men-at-arms belonging to the house, as soon as they were satisfied the princess had been carried away, rushed after the goblins into the hole, but found that they had already so skillfully blockaded the narrowest part, not many feet below the cellar, that without miners and their tools, they could do nothing. Not one of them knew where the mouth of the mine lay, and some of those who had set out to find it had been overtaken by the storm and had not even yet returned. Poor Sir Walter was especially filled with shame, and almost entertained the hope that the king would order him to be decapitated, for the very thought of that sweet little face down amongst the goblins was unendurable. Decapitated means he wished the king would just chop off his head, for he was so filled with shame that he let the princess get dragged away by the goblins. So he thought. When Curdie ran in at the gate with the princess in his arms, they were all so absorbed in their own misery and awed by the king's presence and grief that no one observed his arrival. He went straight up to the king, where he sat on his horse.
Papa! Papa!
The princess cried, stretching out her arms to him.
Here I am!
The king started. The color rushed to his face. He gave an inarticulate cry. Curdie held up the princess, and the king bent down and took her from his arms. As he clasped her to his bosom, the big tears went dropping down his cheeks and his beard. And such a shout arose from all the bystanders that the startled horses pranced and capered, and the armor rang and clattered, and the rocks of the mountain echoed back the noises. The princess greeted them all as she nestled in her father's bosom, and the king did not set her down until she had told them all the story. But she had more to tell about Curdie than about herself, and what she did tell about herself, none of them could understand except the king and Curdie, who stood by the king's knee stroking the neck of the great white horse. And still, as she told what Curdie had done, Sir Walter and others added to what she told, even Looty joining in the praises of his courage and energy. Curdie held his peace, looking quietly up in the king's face, and his mother stood on the outskirts of the crowd, listening with delight, for her son's deeds were pleasant in her ears, until the princess caught sight of her.
And there is his mother, King Papa,
she said.
See, there. She is such a nice mother, and has been so kind to me.
They all parted asunder as the king made a sign to her to come forward. She obeyed, and he gave her his hand, but could not speak.
And now, King Papa,
the princess went on,
I must tell you another thing. One night long ago, Curdie drove the goblins away and brought Looty and me safe from the mountain. And I promised him a kiss when we got home, but Looty wouldn't let me give it to him. I would not have you scold Looty, but I want you to impress upon her that a princess must do as she promises.
Indeed she must, my child, except it be wrong,
said the king.
There, give Curdie a kiss.
And as he spoke, he held her toward him. The princess reached down, threw her arms around Curdie's neck, and kissed him on the mouth, saying,
There, Curdie, there's the kiss I promised you.
Then they all went into the house, and the cook rushed to the kitchen, and the servants to their work. Looty dressed Irene in her shiningest clothes, and the king put off his armor, and put on purple and gold, and a messenger was sent for Peter, and all the miners, and there was a great and grand feast, which continued long after the princess was put to bed. And there was chapter 30. Why are you crying, Rolfie?
I'm just so happy that everything worked out for Curdie and Irene and the Papa and they got to kiss. I'm so happy.
Oh, I know, Rolfie. I'm so happy for them as well. Are you ready to read the next one?
Yeah.
Okay. Here, take this tissue, Rolf. Here, take it.
Okay. Thank you.
Nope, you can keep it, Rolf. I don't want it back.
Oh, okay.
No, don't eat it, Rolfie. Don't eat it. Just throw it away.
Okay.
All right. Sorry, folks. Anyways, chapter 31, titled The Subterranean Waters. The king's harper, who always formed a part of his escort, was chanting a ballad which he made as he went on playing on his instrument, about the princess, and the goblins, and the prowess of Curdie, when all at once he ceased, with his eyes on one of the doors of the hall. Thereupon the eyes of the king and his guest turned thitherward also, which just means turned over there also. Weird word, thitherward. The next moment, through the open doorway, came the Princess Irene. She went straight up to her father, with her right hand stretched out a little sideways, and her forefinger, as her father and Curdie understood, feeling its way along the invisible thread. The king took her on his knee, and she said in his ear,
King Papa, do you hear that noise?
I hear nothing,
said the king.
Listen.
She said, holding up her forefinger. The king listened, and a great stillness fell upon the company. Each man, seeing that the king listened also, and the harper sat with his harp between his arms, and his fingers silent upon the strings.
I do hear a noise,
said the king at length.
A noise as of distant thunder. It is coming nearer and nearer. What can it be?
They all heard it now, and each seemed ready to start to his feet as he listened. Yet all sat perfectly still. The noise came rapidly nearer.
What can it be?
said the king again.
I think it must be another storm coming over the mountain,
said Sir Walter. Then Curdie, who at the first word of the king had slipped from his seat and laid his ear to the ground, rose up quickly, and approaching the king, said, speaking very fast,
Please, your majesty, I think I know what it is. I have no time to explain, for that might make it too late for some of us. Will your majesty order that everybody leave the house as quickly as possible and get up the mountain?
The king, who was the wisest man in the kingdom, knew well there was a time when things must be done, and questions left till afterward. He had faith in Curdie, and rose instantly, with Irene in his arms.
Every man and woman, follow me,
he said, and strode out into the darkness. Before he had reached the gate, the noise had grown to a great thundering roar, and the ground trembled beneath their feet, and before the last of them had crossed the court, out after them from the great hall door came a huge rush of turbid water, and almost swept them away. But they got safe out of the gate and up the mountain, while the torrent went roaring down the road into the valley beneath. Curdie had left the king and the princess to look after his mother, whom he and his father, one on each side, caught up when the stream overtook them and carried safe and dry. When the king had got out of the way of the water, a little up the mountain, he stood with the princess in his arms, looking back with amazement on the issuing torrent, which glimmered fierce and foamy through the night. There Curdie rejoined them.
Now, Curdie,
said the king,
what does it mean? Is this what you expected?
It is, your majesty,
said Curdie, and proceeded to tell them about the second scheme of the goblins, who, fancying the miners of more importance to the upper world than they were, had resolved, if they should fail in carrying off the king's daughter, to flood the mine and drown the miners. Then he explained what the miners had done to prevent it. The goblins had, in pursuance of their design, let loose all the underground reservoirs and streams, expecting the water to run down into the mine, which was lower than their part of the mountain, for they had, as they supposed, not knowing of the solid wall close behind, broken a passage through into it. But the readiest outlet the water could find had turned out to be the tunnel they had made to the king's house, the possibility of which catastrophe had not occurred to the mind of the young miner until he placed his ear close to the floor of the hall. What was then to be done? The house appeared in danger of falling, and every moment the torrent was increasing.
We must set out at once,
said the king.
But how to get to the horses?
Shall I see if we can manage that?
said Curdie.
Do,
said the king. Curdie gathered the men-at-arms and took them over the garden wall and so to the stables. They found their horses in terror. The water was rising fast around them, and it was quite time they were got out. But there was no way to get them out, except by riding them through the stream, which was now pouring from the lower windows as well as the door. As one horse was quite enough for any man to manage through such a torrent, Curdie got on the king's white charger, and leading the way, brought them all in safety to the rising ground.
Look, Curdie,
said Irene, the moment that, having dismounted, he led the horse up to the king. Curdie did look, and saw, high in the air, somewhere about the top of the king's house, a great globe of light, shining like the purest silver.
Oh!
He cried in some consternation. Remember, that's the word that means anxious or scared.
That is your grandmother's lamp! We must get her out! I will go and find her. The house may fall, you know.
my grandmother is in no danger,
said Irene, smiling.
Here, Curdie, take the princess while I get on my horse,
said the king. Curdie took the princess again, and both turned their eyes to the globe of light. The same moment there shot from it a white bird, which, descending with outstretched wings, made one circle round the king and Curdie and the princess, and then glided up again. The light and the pigeon vanished together.
Now, Curdie,
said the princess, as he lifted her to her father's arms.
You see, my grandmother knows all about it, and isn't frightened. I believe she could walk through that water and it wouldn't wet her a bit.
But, my child,
said the king,
you will be cold if you haven't something more on. Run, Curdie, my boy, and fetch anything you can lay your hands on to keep the princess warm. We have a long ride before us.
Curdie was gone in a moment, and soon returned with a great rich fur, and the news that dead goblins were tossing about in the current through the house. They had been caught in their own snare. Instead of the mine, they had flooded their own country, whence they were now swept up, drowned. Irene shuddered, but the king held her close to his bosom. Then he turned to Sir Walter and said,
Bring Curdie's father and mother here. I wish,
said the king, when they stood before him,
to take your son with me. He shall enter my bodyguard at once, and wait further promotion.
Peter and his wife, overcome, only murmured almost inaudible thanks. But Curdie spoke aloud.
Please, your majesty,
he said.
I cannot leave my father and mother.
That's right, Curdie,
cried the princess.
I wouldn't if I was you.
The king looked at the princess, and then at Curdie, with a glow of satisfaction on his countenance.
I, too, think you are right, Curdie,
he said,
and I will not ask you again, but I shall have a chance of doing something for you sometime.
Your majesty has already allowed me to serve you,
said Curdie.
But, Curdie,
said his mother,
why shouldn't you go with the king? We can get on very well without you. But I can't get on very well without you,
said Curdie.
The king is very kind, but I cannot be half the use to him that I am to you. Please, your majesty, if you wouldn't mind giving my mother a red petticoat, I should have got her one long ago, but for the goblins.
As soon as we get home,
said the king,
Irene and I will search out the warmest one to be found, and send it by one of the gentlemen.
Yes, that we will, Curdie,
said the princess.
And next summer we'll come back and see you wear it, Curdie's mother,
she added.
Shan't we, King Papa?
Yes, my love, I hope so,
said the king. Then turning to the miners, he said,
Will you do the best you can for my servants tonight? I hope they will be able to return to the house tomorrow.
The miners, with one voice, promised their hospitality. Then the king commanded his servants to mind whatever Curdie should say to them. And after shaking hands with him and his father and mother, the king and the princess and all their company rode away down the side of the new stream which had already devoured half the road into the starry night. All right, that was chapter 31, but hang on, Rolfe, hold those thoughts. The last chapter is very short, so let's just finish it up and then we'll talk.
Okay.
Chapter 32, titled The Last Chapter. Very creative name, George McDonald. Yeah. All the rest went up the mountain and separated in groups to the homes of the miners. Curdy and his father and mother took Looty with them, and the whole way a light, of which all but Looty understood the origin, shone upon their path. But when they looked round, they could see nothing of the silvery globe. For days and days the water continued to rush from the doors and windows of the king's house, and a few goblin bodies were swept out into the road. Curdy saw that something must be done. He spoke to his father and the rest of the miners, and they at once proceeded to make another outlet for the waters. By setting all hands to the work, tunneling here and building there, they soon succeeded, and having also made a little tunnel to drain the water away from under the king's house, they were soon able to get into the wine cellar, where they found a multitude of dead goblins, among the rest the queen, with the skin shoe gone, and the stone one fast to her ankle, for the water had swept away the barricade which prevented the men-at-arms from following the goblins, and had gently widened the passage. They built it securely up, and then went back to their labors in the mine. A good many of the goblins with their creatures escaped from the inundation out upon the mountain, but most of them soon left that part of the country, and most of those who remained grew milder in character, and indeed became very much like the Scotch brownies. Scotch brownies is not referring to the tasty chocolatey treat. It's actually referring to something of a house elf. So all George McDonald is trying to say is that all the goblins grew much milder and became a lot more like house elves. Their skulls became softer as well as their hearts, and their feet grew harder, and by degrees they became friendly with the inhabitants of the mountain, and even with the miners. But the latter were merciless to any of the cob's creatures that came their way, until at length they all but disappeared. Still,
But, Mr. Author, we would rather hear more about the princess and Curdy. We don't care about the goblins and their nasty creatures. They frighten us, rather.
But you know, if you once get rid of the goblins, there is no fear of the princess or of Curdy.
But we want to know more about them.
Someday, perhaps, I may tell you the further history of both of them, how Curdy came to visit Irene's grandmother, and what she did for him, and how the princess and he met again after they were older, and how... but there, I don't mean to go any farther at present.
Then you're leaving the story unfinished, Mr. Author.
Not more unfinished than a story ought to be, I hope. If you ever knew a story finished, all I can say is, I never did. Somehow, stories won't finish. I think I know why, but I won't say that either now. The end.
Yay! Woo! 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 Yay! Woo! Yay! Woo! Woo! Woo!
So, what you think, Rolfe? Now that we're all through the whole story, what are your thoughts?
Well, I kind of agree with that character that I was playing at the end there and in the beginning of the story.
Ah, right, when you were saying that the story didn't feel finished.
Yes, it didn't. Like, it's cool that the grandmama was looking after everybody and finally everybody believed Irene, but like, who was she?
Well, she was clearly Irene's great-grandmother, but honestly, beyond that, Georgie did not really explain.
What I'd like to know.
Lucky for you, Rolfe, there's a sequel to this book called The Princess and Curdy. I believe that one goes a little more in-depth into some of the characters and where they all came from.
Ooh, we should read that one.
Ah, that's a good idea, little Rolfie. Tell you what, peasants at home, if you would like to hear me read The Princess and Curdy, which is the sequel to The Princess and the Goblin, please send me a letter, or what my court wizard calls an email. Not really sure what that means, but, you know, a letter. Send me a letter telling me if you would like to hear the sequel or if you would like me to tell the fairy tales. Or maybe I'll just do both.
Yay, let's do both!
Settle down, Rolfie, settle down. That will be a time for another time. But for now, little peasants of Camelmore, I would like to say thank you for listening all the way through the story. Oh, and one more thing before you all go. Rolfie, did you think it was me doing the voice of the Princess Irene?
Well, yes, I was watching you do the whole story the whole time. Your lips were moving and blah, blah, blah.
Ah, I tricked you, buddy. Come on out, Ruthie. Yes, say hello, Ruth.
Well, hello.
It's a little gnome lady!
Actually, I'm above average for a gnome lady. The average height for a gnome lady is 3'2". I'm 3'3.5".
Ruth has been sitting behind my throne this whole time. I just wanted to trick you, Rolfie, and I was moving my lips while she was the one doing Irene's voice.
You got me! You totally got me!
Yes, I knew I would, Rolfie. All right. Good night, little peasants of Camelmore. Remember, even though this story is over, I am still sitting high on my throne in Camelmore's castle. Feel free to stop by any time or send a letter by pigeon. Good night, peasants. I'm gonna miss you. Stay safe out there. And remember, do not move back to Camelot. They may have shiny roads and big old houses, but Camelmore has heart. Good night, peasants.
Good night!
Say good night, Ruth.
Sweet dreams as our tale wisps away in your brains.
All right, Ruthie, step away from the mic.
What? Oh, no!
No, we need to turn it off.
I like it!
See, Rolfie likes it.
Good night, everyone.
Good night!
The end.
The end.
The end!
The end.
The end.
Yes, the end.
No, this is my show, my story, the end. And,
The end.
The end!
okay, we're done.